Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
The time has come, ladies and gentlemen. We are officially into the month of August around the Bet the Board home offices, and that can mean only one thing. It's all about the NFL preseason previews. NFL football for real, at least in some capacity, coming in just over a month. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host when it comes to breaking down the National Football League, Payne Insider. And Payne, it feels like we don't get much of an offseason to begin with, and it is officially in the rearview mirror as of now.
We're here. Football season is officially upon us.
I mean, I figured...
Right? That's what it is. August 1st. That's go time.
Do you go to your local haunt to commemorate the start of a new football season to watch the Hall of Fame game? I know that's what all of our listeners really want to know.
No. Maybe I'll dabble a little bit, but it's just, for that stuff, it's easier to watch on playback in a much shorter time frame. Than going for the 3-hour gauntlet this evening. But, you know, we've been prepping for months now, but it just feels like, and you can go at your own pace, right? It's like, okay, we're going to do a team, we're going to do a division, and now it's like, you just know what's coming. It's August 1st. There isn't going to be any time off from now through the Super Bowl. And it just feels like every single year gets a little bit longer as they extend the schedule, not just on the NFL front, but now with the college football playoffs as well. So, buckle up, buddy. Here we are.
Hey, it's pedal to the metal. And to quote the great Joe Kane from one of the finest football movies ever made, the program, it's time to put the women and children to bed and go out looking for dinner, which is the NFL grind that'll kick off in earnest in August and ride us all the way through the middle of February. And it's all about the NFC East today.
Corporate guy officially butchered the quote.
I mean,
just because you didn't feel like putting the oomph in there.
Look, it's a lot of emphasis.
Way to start the season in Todd fashion.
Hey, as you've told me, you have to ramp up. It is a marathon, not a sprint. You can't come out of the gates going 100 miles an hour, so you have to find your stride by about week 9, week 10, or in the case of your beloved Kansas City Chiefs, who you said last year we should just cancel the season if they won the Lombardi Trophy, pick up steam in week 16 and ride that momentum to another Lombardi Trophy. But when we talk the NFC East, Payne, a couple of teams that would love to add a Lombardi Trophy to their trophy case, one of which would be the Dallas Cowboys. And when we look at Dallas, their win total has already taken some money this offseason. We saw a lot of books open at 10.5 shaded to the under. This number now at most prominent shops, 9.5 with decent price tag attached to it going over the total. As far as their odds to win the division, we've seen that shift drastically as well. They actually opened as the favorite to win the NFC East. They are now the second favorite behind the Philadelphia Eagles. Still have to lay a substantial price if you want to back the Cowboys to get into the postseason. And this is an organization, 3 straight 12-win seasons without an appearance in the conference championship game. First team in league history to actually accomplish that feat. The 36 regular season wins over the last 3 seasons are the most by any team without a conference championship appearance in that time frame. As we know, the much maligned Dallas Cowboys haven't been to a conference title game since 1995. And then we get comments from Jerry Jones. This is an all-in campaign. It's this, it's that, and the other. The problem for the Dallas Cowboys, they can't even get all of their key cogs to camp. They have a quarterback on an expiring deal and some major questions that they're going to have to address going into this season. Last year, though, when we talked about Dallas, we knew they were going to have a high-powered offense, and they didn't disappoint. Number 1 in a scoring offense last season, a shade under 30 points per game. They had the second-best third-down offense in the league at a clip just shy of 50%, and they had the league's passing touchdown leader in Dak Prescott. But this was a Cowboys team, Payne, who when they had to step up in class, left a lot to be desired. The coaching staff will be a little bit different. And when you look at Mike McCarthy coming into another campaign, it's clearly NFC Championship or bust. I'm not sure where Dallas's true strengths and weaknesses lie, so we can start on the offensive side, or at least where there's a little bit more continuity, assuming CeeDee Lamb eventually gets paid.
I don't think, just ripping the Band-Aid off here, I don't think this is a team that competes for a Super Bowl this year. I really don't. And you mentioned Mike McCarthy's offense. It certainly didn't start red hot. And that's something that we talked about early last year. But once he started realizing some of his mistakes and understood specifically how to correct some red zone play calling, the Cowboys offense became a juggernaut at that point. It was around week 6. And Dak was virtually unstoppable. And you look at his numbers, it was a career year, so you can see why he wants to be paid. And you see the other quarterbacks that are now being paid, and Dak thinks he deserves to be in that echelon of quarterbacks. And I don't necessarily disagree. Finished second in EPA plus completion percentage over expectation. He was the 3rd most valuable quarterback relative to an average starter last year. And I think, he's had a tendency to fall short in the biggest games, but in totality, if you look at this, Dak has the 2nd highest percentage of games with a passer rating above 100 among active quarterbacks. He trails a guy. His name's Patrick Mahomes.
I think I've heard of him.
It kind of indicates consistency over a larger sample size. I just think Dallas has butchered this, right? They had to figure out if he was their guy before. You pay him a little bit earlier. Then all of a sudden he becomes a value when you look at these current quarterback deals. With the salary cap keep going up, it makes sense to kind of get out ahead on some of these deals. Now, I'm not a big narrative guy, but I think it's fair to wonder how Dak navigates this season if his contract doesn't get sorted out, knowing the efficiency drops in the biggest games. Right now, suddenly every game is a big game for Dak as he's trying to ink this deal. I did hear the Cowboys made an offer to Dak this past Saturday. So let's see if that pushes things closer. CeeDee Lamb is clearly inching closer to the end of his holdout. It sounds like, 4 for 138 is the rumored number there, and that's got to be pretty much in take territory. So I would expect that holdout to end pretty quickly here. The rest of the weapons have to step up, though. We saw Brandon Cooks perform better as the season went on after battling that early season injury and then getting acclimated to a new scheme. If you look at his yards per route run, they doubled from week 10 onward, and about 75% of his season-long touchdowns came over that same stretch, and their camp reports suggest that he's been Dak's go-to guy. There's also some camp reports suggesting that Turpin has showed up in a big way, and Dak's been targeting him frequently. Jake Ferguson made a massive leap in his sophomore season to like a top 8 tight end. If you look at Dak's passer rating when targeting Ferguson, it's 122, and I think now your hope is like, let's see what Tolbert provides. The offensive line is probably the biggest question mark. You have this nice guard duo with Zach Martin and Tyler Smith, but Zach Martin is coming off his worst season, and he turns 34 in November, so you start to wonder a little bit there. Tyler Smith is a plus guard, but he's not elite. It just sounds like, those two are certainly the key cogs, but what surrounds them is really fluid at this point. Terrence Steele at right tackle, he's entering year 5. He was an undrafted guy, and then he tore his ACL in December of 2022, so I think you need him in a big way to return to that 2022 form prior to the knee injury when he was an outstanding run blocker. He's just struggle bus in pass protection his entire career. 6.5% pressure rate allowed on pass block snaps. Last season, it grew to 7%. Steele was 72nd out of 85 qualifying tackles in pass protection. Then you have the rookie Tyler Guyton, who's projected to start at left tackle, although it seems to be a battle in camp with Chuma. Guyton is, you look at him, he's one of those guys coming off the bus. You're like, holy shit, 6'8", 330. But he is a project. He only played 1,000 snaps in 4 seasons between Oklahoma and TCU. Couldn't get on the field at Oklahoma, so he transferred. And for his size, Guyton isn't a guy that provides much push in the run game, and that was at the college level, and he was just a solid pass protector. Brock Hoffman is the projected starting center. He's an undrafted kid heading into year 2, played below replacement level and over 200 snaps last season. I would assume, based on pedigree and the college data, that a guy we're familiar with, 3rd-round pick Cooper Beebe, eventually takes over at center, but it's a new position for him. And if you've read that story, he's like, his mom is helping him with snapping during her work lunch breaks.
Hey, look, that's a football family through and through. I respect the all-in effort that the Beebe family puts into being contributors in the National Football League.
Yeah, so I think if all goes wrong, Dallas could have like a bottom 5 offensive line in the league. If all goes perfect, it's an above-average unit, but certainly not as good as we've grown accustomed to over the last 5 years or so. I think the saving grace might be the fact that we do project the opposing teams on the Cowboys schedule to be bottom 5 in generating pressure. So that's kind of a nice thing to have if the O-line doesn't have cohesion, especially early. The running back room, yikes.
What, you're trying to tell me that Ezekiel Elliott didn't find the fountain of youth and you don't trust a tandem with him and Rico Dowdell capable of providing balance?
So Zeke had a little bit of a resurgence last year, right? He got out of the Dallas nightclubs and went to General Belichick, and it seemed like his body was in the best shape it's been in the last few seasons. So that's a positive. I know Tony Pollard was underwhelming in his first shot at becoming the lead guy, but without him, that room loses all explosiveness. You look at Rico Dowdell, undrafted in 2020, finished outside the top 50 in explosive run percentage last year. Zeke is still a damn good short yardage back, and hopefully that helps some of the short yardage and red zone issues that Dallas had at points last year. And he does still provide some value in the pass game, but Zeke had one explosive run last season on 184 carries. The other notable here, right, is Dallas was fortunate last year playing the very easiest schedule of defenses. Dak and the Cowboys, you mentioned, had this kind of approach where they could play some bully ball, and they faced defenses, 11 of them, that ranked bottom 3rd in the league in efficiency. 7 games against the worst 6 pass defenses in the league. It gets tougher this year. We're projecting Dallas to face an above-average schedule of passing defenses, below-average schedule of defenses overall, but still tougher than the easiest schedule last season. I think there's specific variance to the defenses Dallas faces in 2024 that would make things tougher than our projections, and it starts really in division, right? Giants spent on defense and changed coordinators. Philly used significant draft capital on defense and changed coordinators. Dan Quinn's going to be an upgrade to Washington's defense and is extremely familiar with what goes on inside the Dallas building, especially on offense. So there's an opportunity here for the schedule to be a little bit tougher than we're actually projecting for Dallas's offense.
You mentioned Dallas and the scoring flurry that they went through last season, and just to kind of put that in a little bit of a snapshot, from Week 6 to Week 14, the Cowboys scored at least 7 first-quarter points in every game, which amounted to a franchise record, and scored at least 17-plus first-half points in 7 straight games. So they figured things out in the middle of the campaign, paid dividends, and to your point, the bully ball allowed them to pin their ears back on the defensive side, come after opposing quarterbacks, and also capitalize with creating turnovers. Out is Dan Quinn, who you alluded to, taking the head coaching job in the nation's capital to lead the Commanders. In steps a very familiar name in NFL defensive circles, Mike Zimmer. This is a Cowboys team, though, that did lose one of their depth pieces early on in camp. Sam Williams tore his ACL. Carl Lawson they brought in to try him out to see if he can add some perspective. But this is a group that spent a lot of money on the defensive side of the ball from salary cap allocation. That number has changed going into this year, given some of the contracts that you mentioned there. I mean, this is also a Cowboys team that's benefited immensely from a great turnover ratio over the last 3 seasons. Eventually, what goes up must come down in that particular regard. And if you look at from a down-to-down standpoint, this is a Cowboys defense that didn't overwhelm you. Don't, however, tell that to people ranking the top 100 players in the NFL, with Deron Bland apparently the second coming of Deion Sanders in his coverage ability in the defensive backfield.
I think Dan Quinn is a decent loss, right? There was some down-to-down stuff last year in the metrics that indicated the defense wasn't nearly as good as some thought. Mike Zimmer is an interesting hire. He's been away from the NFL since 2021. There's substantial change coming, right? Mike Zimmer is going to move to a 4-3 base scheme. His philosophy is the polar opposite of Quinn's in that he prefers disguising, right, his defense and going with a lot of sim pressures rather than all-out blitzes. And you start to get some internal information there, and it's like, at Mike Zimmer's request, Micah Parsons dropped 15 pounds so he can be moved around like a queen on a chessboard. And Zimmer's come out and said he believes lining Parsons up at different positions is going to make the Cowboys' defense less predictable. Inherently, that means less snaps on the edge for Parsons, which I'm not sure the Cowboys can afford to do, right? Dallas lost Dorrance Armstrong. They lost Dante Fowler in free agency. Both went to Washington. Sam Williams tore his ACL and MCL this past weekend. And a huge loss, right? If you're following things close enough, Zimmer sounded like he lost his dog, right? And said, we had big plans for Sam. He was going to play 75% of the snaps.
Yep.
And so if you're not lining up Parsons on the edge as much, right, as your true every down lineman, you basically have 32-year-old DeMarcus Lawrence as that stalwart there. And DeMarcus coming off arguably his second best season ever, elite edge setter, but his pressure rate on pass rush snaps last season was his lowest since 2016. And you mentioned it, right? The Cowboys right now, they're in talks and kicking the tire on both Ngakoue, and Carl Lawson was in for a visit, I think, as we're recording this. Let's see if Dallas signs someone. It seems imminent that they're going to. Part of Zimmer's scheme changes to help stop the run while not being as reliant on Overshown and Lafua at linebacker. Neither has taken an NFL snap. This has to be a big year for Mazi Smith, right? He was drafted to fill a specific void in the Cowboys defense, and that's basically taking on two and plugging the run. But Dallas was 24th in yards allowed per rush before first contact last season. So Mazi Smith has to be better. There's questions with depth in the tackle room. Like if Smith doesn't perform, it's basically Osa and Goldston inside. Carl Davis Jr. was signed, but he's played 1,100 career snaps over 8 seasons for 6 different teams, right? He's well below replacement level, and he's, right now 4th in the Cowboys tackle rotation. You were taking some shots at Deron Bland, but I agree, right? The secondary comes with a ton of variance. Clearly, Bland, right, isn't going to pick 9 balls off and return 5 for touchdowns again this season.
How dare you, Payne? Variance isn't a thing in the defensive backfield in the National Football League.
Right, and then his other partner, Mr. Variance, Trevon Diggs, right? He's been a feast or famine corner. It's nice to get him back. Only played 2 games last year, but in 2022 he allowed nearly 70% of targets he faced to be caught, and it's a little concerning that it's August 1, and reports are that Diggs is about a week away from returning to camp after suffering that ACL injury. I'm a little surprised it's taken this long to get back on the field. Malik Hooker's coming off arguably his best season as a pro. Is that repeatable in a new scheme with new verbiage? Donovan Wilson is just a solid piece. So when you kind of tie this all together defensively, Dallas is dealing with a scheme shift. They're dealing with a change in verbiage. At the same time, there's clear expectation for turnover luck to regress. And in 2022, the Cowboys were number 1 in EPA gain from turnovers. Last year, the Cowboys defense had 6 touchdowns of their own. The majority of the Cowboys defensive output came from a front runner position. That's more of the bully ball we're talking about, not necessarily pounding it, on the ground in the run game. But, basically Dak and the offense built leads last year. They led at halftime in 12 games. The Cowboys defense liked playing bully ball against the weak, but they could rarely take a punch from the competent. And you see that in numbers where Dallas was number 1 in EPA surrendered against bottom 10 offenses, but were bottom 3rd of the league against top 10 offenses. And I think we talk all the time about down-to-down success being a more stable metric and therefore more predictive. The Cowboys defense was 27th in success rate allowed on early downs the first 3 quarters in non-garbage time situations. So that was kind of where I was hinting at. It wasn't nearly as good when you dug a little deeper than what it appeared to be on the surface. And when you're positioning yourself as an organization to hand out new deals to both Dak and CeeDee Lamb, suddenly funds get allocated in different areas. And we see that into, this season coming up where Dallas, has the 6th cheapest defense. Now, Dallas will outperform the spend, but there's clear regression coming defensively this season. I fully believe that.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's impossible for this team to kind of keep up that high level that they performed at for stretches last year. You look at some of the crooked numbers that defense gave up when they stepped up in class, and if teams aren't going to be playing from behind and be as predictable, chasing deficits, should Dallas not be as electric early on in games, it'll make for a much bigger path to resistance for this Cowboys team in general. We mentioned the number moving on Dallas to win the division. The team that's now moved to the forefront would be the Philadelphia Eagles, who we talk about rebounding, would love to do so given the tailspin that put a negative look on what was a promising campaign, at least early from a win-loss record, although the underlying numbers suggested it wasn't going to be sustainable. When we look at Philadelphia, big picture-wise, their win total, 10.5, heavily shaded to the over, more than a $3 favorite to punch their ticket back to the postseason. And depending on where you shop, we've seen Philadelphia go from plus 120 to win the division, now as high as minus $1.25 at some books. Prices do vary, so always shop around accordingly. And when we look at this Eagles team, I mean, Nick Sirianni went through this coaching staff and basically had a full house cleaning after last year's abysmal results down the stretch. The Eagles finished the campaign with just one win in their final 7 games and went out with no more than a whimper in a disappointing performance against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wild card weekend. This will mark the 3rd straight season with different offensive and defensive coordinators for the Eagles. I mean, this is a franchise, Payne, that's gone 20-2 through their first 12 weeks combined over the last 2 seasons. They cruised to victory in 2022, though, coming up just short against the Chiefs. And then, of course, last year they flirted with disaster, needing to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, despite facing a number of halftime deficits. Don't tell that to Eagles fans. They told me at the time that was a sign of a good football team who could battle back from adversity. Well, as we've learned in the NFL, if you're constantly coming from behind, not always a harbinger of success going forward. In steps a man to lead the offense that we're all too familiar with. He has drawn plenty of scorn across the league, that being Kellen Moore. And the one thing we saw from the Eagles, their pace of play really fell off. In 2022, the Eagles averaged right around 26 seconds per play in the first half. It allowed them to build tremendous leads and kind of play from the catbird seat. Last season, we talked about it on this very podcast about getting plays in from new offensive coordinator Brian Johnson, and it showed. The Eagles averaged roughly 30 seconds per play in the first half. That had them ranking 25th in tempo. Kellen Moore, been the architect for the number 1 scoring offense twice in 5 years as an offensive coordinator when he was with the Dallas Cowboys in 2019 and 2021. Some familiar faces, I should say, in unfamiliar places. Saquon Barkley gets added to the running back room. No Jason Kelce, though, to anchor that center position along the offensive line. But Payne, if the Eagles are going to return to prominence, they need a healthy Jalen Hurts. Camp reports saying the mobility is back, the speed. Can he find that form that took him to the Super Bowl way back in 2022?
I think so. And, kind of what you were hinting at there was, despite most of the same pieces returning, Philly's offense is going to look vastly different. And it's going to be much improved in my mind. There's an adult in the room with Kellen Moore now, and you hit it perfectly in that we were never in on Brian Johnson. And sure, like some of Kellen's previous offenses grew a touch stale later in the year, but he's never had this much talent to work with. And right off the bat, I can tell you multiple things are changing. Pace, which you hit perfectly, big uptick for the Eagles offense here. Kellen Moore has been an OC the last 5 seasons. Every single offense finished top 5 in pace. There's going to be far more pre-snap motion. If you looked at the Eagles under Brian Johnson, they were dead last in the NFL in motion rate. The Chargers were 8th with Kellen Moore last year. Defense will be on their heels more based upon where guys line up pre-snap. So A.J. Brown, if you're following camp reports, is being moved around the formation this season and has been unstoppable so far. There's a real energy and purpose from the offense, whereas last season, everything just felt slow and out of rhythm. Fully expect Jalen Hurts to release the ball quicker this year. Last season, it was 3.1 seconds, 4th slowest among 41 qualifying quarterbacks. If you're listening to everything coming from Eagles players this offseason, the word you are going to continually hear is freedom. And so I think that's really interesting. It's building some confidence with the players. The one thing that is going to look the same is the RPO base, right? Kellen came out and said this past Saturday the Eagles offense will have his twist on it, but he knows Jalen Hurts operates best from an RPO scheme. I fully expect Jalen Hurts to have a bounce-back season just like Justin Herbert had a year ago under Kellen Moore. Hurts' knee is healthier. The turnover luck is sure to improve. This was nuts to me when I saw this. Hurts had 15 interceptions last year. Came on 16 turnover-worthy throws. That's just horrific misfortune. The game plans Hurts operates will be substantially better. You mentioned the Eagles. They were a bottom 10 offense on early downs the first 3 quarters last season. So that suggests what? That Brian Johnson wasn't very good prior to kickoff, and he wasn't very good adjusting at halftime. And you could see that in something as simple as first half margin, where the Eagles went from leading on average by nearly 8 points at halftime in 2022 to trailing by 1 on average last season. Jalen Hurts is also going to benefit from the schedule of pass defenses this season. We're projecting a bottom 10 schedule in the league there. Last year, Philly faced a top 10 schedule of pass defenses. So I think Hurts catches a nice break there. In my mind, when I see Jalen Hurts this year, he's going to come out, he's going to have this rhythmic bounce to him, and plays are going to be coming in faster. And then you think about what he has at his disposal. I mean, Brown, Smith, Goddard, right? That is like a heck of a big three. Goddard right now averaging 8.5 yards per target, third best among tight ends the last 2 seasons. And then you think about Saquon's contributions as a pass catcher. Could easily have a 60-plus catch season. And I also think when I look at Saquon, he is the perfect fit in Kellen Moore's outside zone run scheme. And you think about that added pace. It wouldn't shock me if Philadelphia, who was already really great in the fourth quarter last year that you mentioned, right? They're going to be able to wear on teams late in games this season. You mentioned Jason Kelce retiring. I think it's a thing, but relative to, right, specifically like Saquon Barkley, he's running behind a much better offensive line even with Jason Kelce gone. If you look last year, Barkley's first contact.
Let's be honest, Payne. We could have gotten 5 listeners, and it would have allowed Saquon to run behind a much better offensive line than what he's dealt with in New York when they were all banged up.
I mean, last year his first contact point was 0.9 yards. It was 2.1 yards for DeAndre Swift behind the Eagles' offensive line. Something as simple as run block win rates, right? Eagles were number 1 last season. Giants were 29. So it's a massive upgrade for Barkley. I think he fits this system well. Did they overpay? Probably, but it's a different overpay for them because you're removing from a division opponent while you're adding to yours, right? It's different than just taking a free agent from someone in a different conference or division. We're also projecting the Eagles to face a bottom 5 schedule of run defenses this season. I think that's going to help the Eagles' red zone rushing efficiency on early downs too. That was bottom 10 last season. Wouldn't be surprised with Saquon, a healthy Hurts, leaning on teams late that Philly returns to a top 10 red zone rushing efficiency type offense. I think if you had questions about the Eagles' offense, right, it's clearly at center. Maybe a little bit at right guard. You have Cam Jurgens replacing Jason Kelce, but Cam actually is returning to his natural position at center. And I think that's helpful, right? He was the 51st overall pick in 2022. Mekhi Becton seems to be kicking inside to right guard. He just needs to get in better shape over the next month. You've heard some stories about him.
You didn't like the story about him losing his lunch 8 times or whatever ridiculous amount it was on the first day of practice?
You would hope at some point the light just turns on, right? I mean, it's just because he's got all the talent in the world. He is battling Tyler Steen. Tyler Steen is dealing with an ankle injury right now that we're going to have to monitor. I think if everything was even, right, Tyler Steen's probably starting at guard. Very simple for me, right? Like massive stock arrow up for the Eagles offense. And I think from both a visual and data perspective, Philly's offense is going to look a lot less lethargic and just be far more efficient this year. So this is a clear buy offensively for the Eagles. You
mentioned Dallas Goedert, and I think he almost becomes that X factor as a potential third weapon behind A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. The biggest thing for Dallas, just getting him on the field and keeping him there. Hasn't played a full season since his rookie campaign in 2018, and when we look at the wide receiver 3 position for Philadelphia, oft injured Paris Campbell appears to be the front runner there, but I think for college football fans that had a chance to watch Aeneas Smith and know what he can do, and he has the ball in his hands, become a very unique weapon for Philadelphia to lean into if they're able to get him going. We mentioned the change at offensive coordinator, Payne, and how it was an upgrade going to Kellen Moore. Defensively, another familiar name takes over there at DC, and that, of course, being Vic Fangio. We look at Philadelphia, and as a group defensively last year, they completely cratered in the highest leverage situations year over year. Finished 31st in red zone defense and 30th when it came to getting off the field on third downs compared to where they were a year before when they were close to league average. And why is that relevant? Well, when you're playing with a lead that you built at halftime and your league average, you don't have to get off the field on third down consistently here and there. And one of the big reason those areas dipped was a pass rush that fell from number 1 in the league outside the top 20, given the game state that they were forced to endure. But let's not sugarcoat it. Philadelphia's secondary was an abject disaster. So what does Howie Roseman do during the draft? Goes out there and picks up arguably the number 1 cover corner in Quinion Mitchell coming out of Toledo, gets another impact defensive back, one who hasn't really been on the field dealing with a hamstring injury from Iowa, and Cooper DeJean, and also remakes a little bit of the pass rush. Hassan Reddick Fletcher Cox, Kevin Bayard gone. In comes Bryce Huff, Devin White. We can say what we want about his ability as a coverage linebacker from Tampa, and a veteran in C.J. Gardner-Johnson as well. When we look at the change in philosophy at defensive coordinator, Payne, another side of the ball where you feel the stock arrow points in only one direction?
Yeah, I think that's the case. And this wasn't a surprise last year. We called for defensive regression. Just the dip was far larger than anyone could have projected. I mean, they went from top 3 in schedule adjusted efficiency in 2022 to bottom 3 last year. Up front, the pass rush win rate dipped 5% year over year. So did the sack percentage. The defensive line, didn't penetrate overly well against the run either, and that was why they had some of those woes you mentioned in red zone defense. 25th in yards allowed before first contact per rush. So the run defense declines, the pressure declines. One hand kind of washes the other, and so the Eagles secondary plummeted to 27th in EPA per dropback allowed. Fortunately, when you project ahead to this season, there's multiple points of positivity for me, right? The cohesion and competence being 2, right? Vic Fangio returns. He was an Eagles consultant in 2022. Philly wanted him last year, but they lost the bidding war to Miami.
Yep.
He's back now, right? It's a huge upgrade. The Desai-Patricia, duo was a disaster, and neither really pulled in the same direction, and they had vastly differing schemes, and Philly was trying to incorporate those different schemes at different points in the season. So it was a struggle. Defensive line should get back towards the top of the league. Jalen Carter was dominant in multiple games, just needs to find consistency. As a rookie, though, he was a plus run stopper, 12% pressure rate on pass rush snaps from inside. Jordan Davis, similar story. The highs are elite, just too many lows. Milton Williams is a nice young piece inside. You mentioned Bryce Huff. That was someone we specifically highlighted during our Jets preview last season, saying he needs more snaps. He ended up getting more snaps, the most of his career, right? And he was elite in getting to the quarterback. 20% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, 22% pass rush win rate. You also have the veterans in Josh Sweat and Brandon Graham. They return. Those two added over 100 pressures last season. Nolan Smith is the upside speed guy. Can he take the next step? If he does, this defensive line is really good. Linebacker room you hinted at, right? It's just completely morphed. Out are Nicholas Morrow and Zach Cunningham. I will say, you couldn't have projected their simultaneous output last season. Like Morrow and Cunningham, I thought exceeded expectation. Zach Bond and Devin White are now the starters. It's an interesting duo, right? Like both are wildly talented and drafted quite high. Neither has lived up to the hype, but you always have to bet on Fangio getting the best from his linebackers. The secondary is where the massive improvement projection comes from. You still have veterans in Darius Slay and James Bradbury. They're getting pushed by the young guys. You mentioned Quinyon Mitchell in round 1. He should start beside Slay. So Bradbury becomes a depth piece. Quinyon Mitchell's interesting from the perspective of played at the lower level, right in the MAC, and they played a lot of zone coverage. And so no one was quite sure how he'd fare in man. Went to the Senior Bowl and just dominated in man coverage from day one. So that's a breath of fresh air. Cooper DeJean gets added to the room as well. C.J. Gardner-Johnson returns after a 1-year stint in Detroit. Talks of moving him more to that safety role. We'll see. Isaiah Rodgers is really interesting. He was an efficiency monster for the Colts in 2021 and 2022 before getting popped for gambling and was suspended last season. These are the kinds of acquisitions that shrewd GMs make. Wildly efficient player in his prime at a premium position, but it only costs $1 million because of an off-field incident. So Isaiah Rodgers come out, said all the right things, that he's not going to waste his second chance. You have Reed Blankenship, who's a plus safety, and he continues to improve. Avonte Maddox, when healthy, was solid in 21 and 22. Can he return to form? Philly just has a ton of options in the secondary, and I trust Vic Fangio to figure out the right group. And we're also projecting a massive dip in competition. Philly faces a bottom 5 schedule of passing offenses. So this secondary is going to be much improved year over year.
I think it was interesting too, and when you're a veteran that's accomplished as much as he has throughout his various stops along the way, Vic Fangio more or less said he's going to play his best players in the defensive backfield regardless of experience. So I think he's saying the quiet part out loud in terms of what kind of expectations he has for the rookies that the Eagles use such high draft capital on to try and be able to make that happen. And you mentioned James Bradbury. I mean, he definitely underwhelmed last year. Interesting to see him getting some reps at safety to see if he can make that adjustment at this point in his career, rather than being a lockdown cover corner. So Philadelphia, no doubt a team with stock arrows pointing in the right direction, and you can see a lot of that being reflected in the betting market. You can follow Payne on social media at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Of course, most importantly, as always, for all things Bet the Board related, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And if you haven't already done so, make your August resolution to sign up for the Bet the Board podcast newsletter delivered directly to you each and every Friday throughout the football season. Some great content, reminders for things that you may have missed throughout the course of the week, and maybe most importantly, an additional best bet, since we want to get you to the window as often as we can throughout the football season. And when we go from the two teams most likely Payne competing for division supremacy to those other two teams, we can start with the New York Giants, who see their regular season win total 6.5, heavily shaded to the under. Long shots to make the playoffs at a price tag of more than 3-1. And if you believe in miracles, as Giants fans maybe do, about 15-1, the going rate for them to come out atop the heap in the NFC East. As far as the Giants, though, this was a major regression candidate going into 2023, and they did not disappoint in that regard when it came to underwhelming market expectations. Believe you guys were first to market going under that win total, and despite the Giants' best effort down the stretch with Tommy DeVito under center, they weren't able to exceed odds makers' expectations when things started. Schedule a little bit interesting for the Giants this year. Their bye doesn't come until week 11, and after a home opener versus the Vikings, they'll play 3 road games in 4 weeks. Their lone home game during that stretch, a short week matchup with the Dallas Cowboys. But they should have, hopefully, a little bit of a silver lining as Daniel Jones returns to potential health for an offense that ranked 32nd in the league each of the last 2 years in first quarter points, consistently found themselves behind the sticks and down in distance. They saw their red zone efficiency plummet year over year, and the Giants have the fewest explosives in the league over the last 2 seasons, which led to them drafting arguably the most explosive wide receiver, not named Marvin Harrison Jr., to go inside the top 10. In Malik Neighbors, but they'll have to do so without Saquon Barkley in the backfield, some shuffling at other pieces, bring in Devin Singletary from the Houston Texans, bring in Drew Lock as a backup quarterback, but this is a team that we can't sugarcoat from an offensive standpoint. We're 30th in points per game, 29th in yards per game, 31st in passing yards per game, and last in sacks allowed. Payne, what does it look like with the Daniel Jones experience back and at the forefront of the Giants' attempts to return to relevance?
Brian Daboll still has his work cut out for him. And
it's the shortest team preview we can do. All right, moving on to the Commanders.
You're staring down the barrel of a bottom 5 quarterback, a bottom 5 offensive line, a bottom 5 running back group, and if the camp reports are any indication, when Malik Neighbors isn't on the field, this Giants offense has a bottom 5 pass catching group. And everything I'm hearing is the offense goes as Malik Neighbors goes right now. And you outlined like the simplistic core of the Giants' issues. They allowed far too many negative plays, generated far too few big plays, right? When you're surrendering 84 sacks and you're getting behind the down and distance, but you're also dead last in big gains, how do you move the football and score points? It's really that simple of an equation. And unless, a 2022 anomaly transpires again, which was mostly schedule-aided and catching some teams by surprise, this is going to be Daniel Jones' final season as the Giants quarterback. He's 9 months removed from an ACL injury. His mobility is far and away his greatest trait. Only Justin Fields and Josh Allen have generated more scramble EPA than Daniel Jones the last 2 seasons. And you hate to throw the jab, but for a guy that graduated from Duke, Daniel Jones seems to be a really poor pre-snap player and an extremely slow processor, and it's led to those high sack numbers despite his mobility. And you just look specifically as a thrower, since 2019, Daniel Jones is QB 42 in EPA plus completion percentage over expectation among quarterbacks with at least 400 snaps. You're coming into this season with some of the same question marks that we've had with Daniel Jones his entire career, right? I mean, arm strength is a question. Only an 8% deep ball throw rate. So that's basically throws that travel 20-plus yards. He's not really targeting that area of the field. He's not threatening a defense, and that allows defenses to play in a phone booth. And for someone that throws short incessantly, Daniel Jones' accuracy is less than ideal. Again, if you remove that anomaly 2022 season, Daniel Jones has finished 37th, 22nd, 26th, and 29th in adjusted accuracy. Go ahead.
No. I was going to say, yikes. Just listening to you rattle off those numbers there. Not good.
Now, right, you have to be fair. And we've kind of mentioned this in the past two previews, but he's played behind a dog shit offensive line. It's been a revolving door. I just, the offensive line issues feel like an annual tradition for the Giants. I think things can improve, right? Andrew Thomas is a hit. If he stays healthy and returns to his 2022 form, the Giants have an elite left tackle. Jermaine Illuminor is slated to start at right tackle. He had a little bit of a career revitalization the last two seasons in Las Vegas. If he plays like he did in 2022, it's a massive upgrade over the injured Evan Neal, who probably should be kicked inside to guard at this point because he's a matador at tackle. I mean, just 10% pressure rate allowed on pass block snaps in 2 seasons. But let's see how right tackle plays out. John Michael Schmitz is slotted in at center, right? He's allowed to improve. He was a second-round pick last year. He's also battling an injury, though. John Runyon was signed this offseason, replacement-level player. Greg Van Roten was picked up days ago. He can play 3 positions. Career year last year on over 1,000 snaps. You have Aaron Stinney, who was signed. He's a Super Bowl champion, replacement-level player. I don't think a lot of these guys are great, but at least there's some experience. There's professional bodies in the room. There's young guys with potential to grow. Again, like not a great O-line, but I think it improves year over year with better injury luck. Without Saquon Barkley, the weapons are pretty bleak. Devin Singletary probably isn't an RB1, although he did finish 19th in yards created among qualifying backs last season. Eric Gray provides some potential upside, but the running backs need to be good because that's the part of the Giants' offense that gets a little bit of a reprieve this season. They're projected to face a bottom 10 schedule of run defenses. The pass-catching group surrounding Malik Nabers needs to be better. You have Darius Slayton. I think he's a solid number 2 or 3. Jalen Hyatt, I know every Giants fan is just chomping at the bit, right? Like he's got to be the guy.
He ain't that
Brian
dude.
Brian Daboll has to create space for him because he can't separate. He can't get off coverage. And so Hyatt looks fantastic, like running downfield, and he's viewed as a deep threat. Averaged less than 1 yard per route run. Wan'Dale Robinson, another year removed from the injury, should be a decent slot, and Bellinger is a below replacement level tight end. The passing schedule does the Giants no favors. We're projecting Daniel Jones to face a top 5 schedule of pass defenses, an above average schedule of pass rushing defenses. There's just not much talent on this Giants offense aside from Andrew Thomas and Malik Nabers. And I know a lot of people are probably thinking, hey, if the Giants offense doesn't perform, is Brian Daboll going to be on the hot seat? I don't think that's a thing. I very much, it would have to be a catastrophic season where you just win like 0 games, 2 games, 3 games. I think if Brian Daboll wins somewhere in that 5 to 8 range, right, he's certainly back for next season. This is an organization, a GM that is very, very familiar with Brian Daboll. They came over from Buffalo together. This is not his quarterback, Daniel Jones, so they're at least going to give him a shot with his own quarterback, whether it be one in free agency or the draft or both. So I don't know how good the Giants' offense is going to look this season. But again, I think maybe the offensive line slightly improved. Malik Nabers an absolute dog. So we'll see what Brian Daboll can whip up.
This Giants offense is going to look absolutely electric in 2025 when they draft Shedeur Sanders, number 1 overall, to try and anchor that team going forward. Well, we go from the offensive side to the defensive side, a change of philosophy there as well. Wink Martindale out as defensive coordinator, talked about his new landing spot and the kind of impact he could have at the college level, taking over in the maize and blue at Michigan. Shane Bowen comes in. And when we look at this Giants team by the numbers defensively last year, they had the highest blitz and man coverage rate of any team in the NFL last season, but were 22nd in scoring defense and 29th in total defense, 28th in yards per play allowed, 29th in pressure rate despite that high blitz rate. And the Giants flat out struggled to slow down opposing running backs. Finished 29th in yards before contact allowed to running backs. Drafting Tyler Nubin, he comes in to help that ailing secondary from Minnesota, but they'll do so without Xavier McKinney. They paid a king's ransom paying to bring in Brian Burns. It should solidify what this team can do along the defensive line, but at the same time, I mean, the price tag they paid for Burns to pair him up with Kayvon Thibodeau and Dexter Lawrence, that defensive line, I'm not sure if Burns went out there and had 30 sacks, it would warrant the number that they put on him trading for him from Carolina.
It's been coming up FSU for about a year now, so things are heading in the right direction. You mentioned Wink is gone. In comes Shane Bowen from Tennessee, spent 6 seasons under Mike Vrabel, so you have a very good idea of what the Giants' defensive structure is going to look like, right? It's a 3-4 scheme. Front seven is going to play downhill with heavy zone coverage in the back. Blitz rates are going to decrease. Wink's defense are always towards the top of the league in that department. The Titans were in the bottom third of the league in blitz rate, but when Shane Bowen does send blitz, it's pretty exotic. The blitz packages are solid. It gets home at a good rate. The Giants' front seven on paper is the best part of the entire team, in my opinion. You mentioned Dexter Lawrence. That guy is a menace, right? Third in pass rush win rate despite facing double teams on more than 70% of snaps last season. You mentioned the trade for Brian Burns. Certainly gave up too much, but a damn good player. Plus player getting up the field, plus player dropping in coverage. Does struggle to set the edge and tackle, though, just because of his size. Kayvon Thibodeau needs a bounce-back season, and that's going to sound crazy to Giants fans who just look at a box, your general stats column and see 13 sacks. The reality is that was a bit of a mirage, right? Thibodeau only had an 8% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. That will never equate to 13 sacks again. Thibodeau's missed tackle rate more than doubled from his rookie season, and he didn't set the edge nearly as well in the sophomore campaign either. Based on what the Giants have spent financially and in draft capital, that trio has to be elite. The other guys are interesting, right? DJ Davidson, Nacho, Aziz, and Jordan Phillips have all underwhelmed in their careers, but they all have the ability to flash. You see the flash plays. Just not a lot of consistency. So they need to find that. There's an emphasis on getting upfield, upfield, upfield. It's the constant phrase that's coming out of Giants camp. They weren't happy finishing 29th in yards allowed per rush before first contact. That was an area that the Titans have been very good in previous seasons under Bowen. Linebacker group took a step forward last year after signing Bobby Okereke. Had a career year. Speed backer, good in coverage, good against the run, had his best tackling season. Micah McFadden improved a great deal from his rookie to sophomore season. Liability in coverage, and the tackling has to improve. But if he takes another step forward, that'd be huge there. Isaiah Simmons is a name that everyone's familiar with. He actually carved out a coverage role and had his best season last year. Seems like the light came on, and he's getting to a playable level. And I think the idea is that Simmons, based upon his athleticism, is going to play all over. The massive question mark, though, for the Giants is in the back. Secondary, it has holes, right? Joe Schoen chose not to make a serious play at retaining Xavier McKinney. He was their best guy in the back. You're looking at Deontay Banks needing a monster sophomore season. He flashed at times last year, only allowed an 84 passer rating when the closest defender in coverage. You have your third-year corner, Cordell Flott, struggled last season, allowed 65% of targets to be caught, gave up nearly as many touchdowns as havoc plays created in the pass game, and he really, really tailed off the final 6 games. You have your third-round pick, Drew Phillips, seems to have worked his way into the starting nickel spot already. Jason Pinnock, solid safety, had his best season in coverage as his role expanded last year to over 1,000 snaps. And then you have Dane Belton. Seems like he is probably going to beat out the rookie Tyler Nubin for the time being at strong safety. I don't really like this secondary, if I'm being honest. Maybe the saving grace here is schedule. The Giants faced the very toughest schedule of offenses last season. Now they're projected to face an above-average schedule. I think what was obvious to regress here is the turnover luck. The Giants forced 31 turnovers last year, led the league in EPA gain from those turnovers. The reason Wink was canned, aside from clashing with Dayball, is the Giants' defense was really phony. and got crushed on a down-to-down basis. They were the 4th worst in success rate allowed. So I think when you look at this, right, overarching here, the market is calling for the Giants to improve. It's probably not going to improve at the level fans are hoping for, right? That the fans believe that 2022 is going to happen again. If you look last year, the data suggests New York was more of like a 4.2 win team, and they're now being priced in the market at like 6.2. So you can see the clear improvement. I just don't think, you get to 6 or 7, the Giants fans are going to be really all that happy. But to me, when I look at this roster, 6, 7, 8 wins would be a fantastic job by Brian Daboll.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. I mean, trying to navigate through the troubled waters that is Daniel Jones as your starting quarterback. The Giants coaching staff deserves a world of credit for cobbling together wins late in the year with Tommy DeVito, upsetting the Eagles down the stretch, and basically keeping that whole locker room pulling in the same direction. You hope it's a sign of things to come when they ultimately get the pieces they need to allow them to compete in the rugged landscape that is the NFC East.
Do you think Daboll got any of DeVito's pizza money there? Because he was supposed to do that signing at a pizza shop, right? And his agent bumped him at the last minute from $10,000 to $20,000 for that as Daboll was stacking some wins with him.
I mean, judging by the newly reconfigured physique of Brian Daboll that we saw in the offseason version of Hard Knocks, I don't think he's spending a lot of time in pizza parlors in the tri-state area in any capacity. He appears to be a kale smoothie guy. I mean, from the looks of things on the outside.
He is he's in better shape this season, let's put it that way, and very, very positive mindset. He's been on the mental things, clearing that side up as well. So I think he's going to put together, right, some very good game plans. It's just there's not much to work with, and God forbid, Malik Neighbors suffers some type of injury. Like, this offense is going to be dreadful if you're listening to these camp reports. I mean, Daniel Jones through about 5-6 practices cannot hit water if he fell out of a boat. So.
Well, look, we know being the head coach of the New York Giants will challenge your mentals on a week-in, week-out basis. So maybe part of the offseason regimen was patience from Brian Daboll to try and know what he's going to have to go through with a roster that doesn't appear poised to compete with some of the big boys in the league. Last but not least, Payne, when we talk about the NFC East, it's the Washington Commanders. And when we look at their numbers in the betting market in terms of big picture forecast, their win total sits at 6.5, largely flat across the board. Playoff long shots at a price tag right around 3-1 or greater to make the postseason. And they find themselves as the 3rd favorite in the double-digit range to win the NFC East. Culture change continues, along with a roster and coaching overhaul from top to bottom under new ownership. Washington has now gone 7 straight seasons without a winning record. They've used 12 starting quarterbacks since 2018, the most in the NFL. We can go all the way back to 2002, 25 starting quarterbacks during that span. It's a far cry from the kind of continuity that we've seen from the Green Bay Packers. And the winningest quarterbacks during that stretch, a true who's who of Todd Collins, Alex Smith, and Taylor Heineke. Last won a playoff game as a franchise back in 2005. And Dan Quinn's biggest job will be returning the defense to a level of respectability after spending the last 3 seasons as the Cowboys DC. The Cowboys, a unit that turned and morphed into a top 5, both scoring and total defense group. As far as their schedule, the Commanders start with 3 or 4 games on the road. They don't have a bye until week 14. Probably not ideal when you have a young quarterback who might have a need to hit the reset button. But when we talk about coaching changes, Payne, it's not just Dan Quinn at head coach. It's a change in offensive philosophy as well. Eric Bieniemy, last year's offensive coordinator, off to Westwood for Deshaun Foster. Cliff Kingsbury takes over, and the familiarity here, Cliff Kingsbury worked with a quarterback that had a very similar skill set in Kyler Murray at Arizona, now tasked with allowing Jaden Daniels to adjust to life in the National Football League.
So, and we can start this in a number of directions. Maybe we go overarching before we get into each side of the ball, but I think this has got to be positive for Washington, right? I mean, there's adults in the room now. You look at the owner who you're probably familiar with, Josh Harris. He was one of the more successful private equity investors. He owns pieces of the 76ers, Devils, and Joe Gibbs Racing, which probably is how you would know him. So there's a background of competent sports ownership. Maybe 76ers fans would disagree there, but you look at Dan Quinn. Does he have some issues? Sure. But I think your hope is that he learned from past mistakes as a head coach. Does Cliff Kingsbury have weaknesses? Absolutely. But it is a massive upgrade over Eric Bieniemy, who the world finally found out was clueless, something we've been saying for years. Virtually everything Bieniemy did last season was incompetent, right? Predictability in formations, not helping a young quarterback with using play action, not helping a young quarterback with using motion, not running into light boxes, throwing incessantly from shotgun into 7- and 8-man drop coverages. I don't know if Sam Howell is an NFL starting quarterback. I would lean towards no. But Eric Bieniemy didn't give the poor kid a chance. So relative to what's been in Washington's front office and on the field, there's a far greater level of competence, and I think that's a breath of fresh air for Washington fans. And I'm not sure this is the regime that's going to take you back to the promised land, but there's certainly a very good chance of getting out of the cellar and no longer being like the league's laughingstock here. Offensively, I think is probably a good place to start because of Jaden Daniels. Listen, I think Washington's offense is going to improve just by having a clue, right? You'd think putting Jaden Daniels in better positions is going to negate some of the negative plays. You go back to Sam Howell last year. He took 65 sacks, had 31 turnover-worthy throws that resulted in 21 interceptions, and then tack on another 4 fumbles. Cliff Kingsbury's talked about going more no huddle. So you're going to see Washington's pace increase a little bit. The deep throw game with Terry McLaurin is going to be a staple. And if you've followed the Commanders' camp, there's been lots of splash plays. I think now your hope is that there's more down-to-down consistency that gets found as Jaden Daniels grows a little bit. There's rumors of a quarterback battle going on right now, but Marcus Mariota's incompetent.
I mean, if they went into the year starting Marcus Mariota, I would start to have some serious concerns about this new coaching staff.
Right, and Jaden Daniels is a rookie, sure. And certainly he deserves time to grow, but he turns 24 in December. So he's like 2 years older than a guy like Drake May. Now, I'm interested to see what this looks like. I think you can be really excited by some of Jaden Daniels' metrics, his athleticism. However, he's far from a perfect prospect. There's been better number 2 overall picks, and this is coming from a guy that only bet one Heisman future last year, and it was Jaden Daniels. And when I look at Jaden Daniels, his windup is elongated when he tries pushing the ball downfield. And for all the deep ball love that Jaden gets, he really has to set and step into the ball. There's a lot of underthrows on that tape. And if you notice, when he has to throw with mostly his arm, the arm talent isn't off the charts good. It's actually average at best. I do like his touch. Some of the velocity stuff in the intermediate areas is really good, but LSU didn't really ask him to throw to the middle of the field ever. And part of the reason you and I placed this Heisman bet on Daniels last year was threefold. Right, it was a great offensive line, it was elite receivers, and it was a manageable schedule. LSU's offensive line provided protection to where Daniels never really had to do much at the line of scrimmage pre-snap. The elite receivers typically won so early to where Daniels never had to process all that often or go through his reads. And it wasn't just Neighbors and Brian Thomas at LSU. Think back to Jaden Daniels at Arizona State. He got to throw to Ayuk and Ricky Pearsall. That's 4 first-round receivers in total, right?
Doesn't hurt.
And then you think, no. And then you think about the third factor was LSU's schedule last year. It was pretty soft in totality. And, he put up video game numbers as a whole, but when he stepped up in class, it was struggle city. 70% adjusted accuracy against Florida State. Negative EPA per pass in the second and third quarters of that game. The only reason Daniels' fourth quarter looks decent is that 75-yard bomb to Brian Thomas down 45-17 with a minute to go, and FSU had 4 freshmen in the secondary. Against Alabama last year, 70% adjusted accuracy from a clean pocket, 98 passer rating. You go back to that redshirt junior season there, Daniels wasn't good against A&M. He was terrible the first 3 quarters against FSU. He was benched against Georgia. Against the best defenses the last 2 seasons, Jaden Daniels hasn't been a good passer. He's a very slow processor, and it's why a guy so mobile and athletic takes gobs of sacks.
Is this your long-winded way of saying that Sam Hartman deserves more consideration as an undrafted free agent to start week 1 for the Commanders?
No.
Okay.
No.
I just wanted to check. I just wanted to get that out there. Being the president of the Sam Hartman fan club, I'm not sure if he's better served to be a backup in the NFL or maybe a starter in the league north of the border.
Listen, as long as Sam Hartman's cashing checks,
I'm all for it. Trust me. Good dude. I'm all for it.
He's got great hair. Good dude. I also think about Jaden Daniels, right, and some of his mobility. If you look at a lot of the rush yards, it came with teams dropping 7 and 8 into coverage because they were deathly afraid of the NFL receivers. There's not a lot of instances either where Daniels goes down. He's a very upright runner. He's not going to be able to move a pile like Jalen Hurts. He's going to take some hits. Now, that rushing ability certainly raises the floor of production, especially early as a rookie. I just don't see the kind of prospect most number 2 picks are at quarterback. I mean, C.J. Stroud's tape was exponentially better than Jaden Daniels. I hope this works. I think Jaden Daniels is a good kid, and everything that you hear from him, right, he's a worker, right? He's going to have his head in the playbook. He's going to do everything to improve. But you start to look at a kid that's like 24, and you're like, his ceiling is probably closer to being reached than other kids in the draft. Like, again, Drake May's 21 right now. What's around Jaden Daniels is serviceable. Offensive line, has some questions at tackle, but the interior seems pretty set with Tyler Bayadash at center, plus player. Sam Cosby and Nick Allegretti at guard. Cosby is, the best of the bunch, coming off a career year, top 5 guard last season, was good in both pass protection and as a run blocker. Nick Allegretti was a depth piece in Kansas City, but he filled in down the stretch and allowed them to not have a massive hole at guard and really assisted them in that Super Bowl run. Tackle position's far more fluid. I know everyone penciled Lucas in as the Commander's starting left tackle, but I'm hearing third-round rookie Brandon Coleman has a tiny lead in that competition. Coleman's had a monster camp. He's drawn praise from virtually every single coach. Andrew Wiley did return to practice after injury. He was immediately slotted back in at right tackle. I just don't love the idea of a rookie third-rounder and Andrew Wiley as my starting left tackles. Wiley allowed over a 6% pressure rate the last 2 seasons and 18 sacks. The weapons around Jaden Daniels aren't perfect. To me, the running back room has questions, right? Brian Robinson is a solid short yardage back, provides stability in the throw game, but he's not dynamic. And you look at him last year, despite facing light boxes at one of the league's highest rate, only had a 34% success rate on early downs. That was 42nd among qualifying running backs. Austin Eckler reunites with Anthony Lynn. What are you getting from him, right? Is this a bounce-back year? Was last year an anomaly? He's 29 years old. He looked extremely old as a runner. He was 63rd in explosive run rate, 69th in total EPA. Running back room needs to be a factor because Washington faces a bottom 10 schedule of run defenses this season. That would help out a rookie quarterback like Jaden Daniels. We're members of the Terry McLaurin fan club. That poor guy has been catching dog shit basically his entire career. He just has not had a competent quarterback. I would expect more explosives from him this season. Oddly last year, but again, chalk this up to Eric Bieniemy. Washington was 25th in air yards despite trailing the 8th most minutes. So I would expect just the ADOT and the air yards to increase this year. Jahan Dotson needs a bounce back season. Terrible sophomore campaign, 0.8 yards per route run. You listen to Dotson, he claims he feels more comfortable in Kingsbury's offense. He's playing freer. He's playing faster. Tight end room basically needs Zach Ertz to be good for about the first month to buy time for Ben Sinnott to eventually take over. It'll sound surprising because you went out and drafted the number 2 quarterback overall, and you got a new offensive coordinator that's going to be far more competent than the last. But I do think there's far more variance to Washington's offense than their defense this season.
It's interesting. This is a team that now has a little bit of hope there. We mentioned adults in the room and an organization that's trending in the right direction, but they need the players to be able to go out there and materialize some of those visions into actual tangible results. And to your point, it's an offense that I think is in prove-it type territory to be able to get to that next level. But you mentioned the defense, and when we look at a defensive-minded head coach, you have to imagine that Dan Quinn's fingerprints will be all over this particular grip. Jack Del Rio gone as the defensive coordinator. Joe Witt Jr. steps in, a lot of familiarity as he was formerly with Dallas, so knows Dan Quinn all too well. This is a group that finished last in both scoring defense and total defense for the first time since 1959. They allowed their most points per game in a season as a franchise since 1954, allowed 39 passing touchdowns in 2023, tied for the third most in NFL history, last in point per game differential and turnover differential as well, ranked 30th or worse in EPA per snap, total yards, total EPA, and 30-plus yard play margin. When we look at Dan Quinn's defensive performances over the last couple of years in Dallas, areas where they did extremely well, they were great in intercepting the ball with Trevon Diggs and Deron Bland, who we highlighted earlier, breaking down the Cowboys, outstanding in the takeaway department, takeaway EPA. So what do? They draft a couple of what they hope are going to be difference makers in Jerzon Newton coming in from Illinois, Mike Sandersell from Michigan. In terms of additions, Dorrance Armstrong, Frankie Louvu, Bobby Wagner, and Jeremy Chin. Payne, when we look at this Washington Commanders defense, it's hard to get worse than what we saw last year. We saw them deal pieces in Montez Sweat to the Bears and Chase Young in the middle of the season, so we know that the front seven is going to at least theoretically believe in Jonathan Allen and Daron Payne. But other than that, in terms of forging a defensive identity, can Dan Quinn get this group to show market improvement right out of the gates from day one?
I think so, right? And our feelings on Ron Rivera are well known by now. Easily one of the worst coaches in the NFL over the last half decade. And, we knew he was hamstringing his own offenses a majority of the time, but it was a little bit shocking that a guy lauded for being a great defensive mind continued to field incompetent defenses. And last year was like a make or break season for him. And Washington's defense was 31st in schedule adjusted efficiency and dead last in EPA surrendered. So, getting rid of Ron Rivera is a massive upgrade. And again, right, you mentioned like the common theme is adults in the room, and you are spot on. Like Dan Quinn's fingerprints are going to be all over this Washington defense, but Joe Witt is going to call the plays. They bring in a veteran in Bobby Wagner to help change the culture and be a leader on the field and in the locker room. And I know Wagner doesn't have the same range at 34, but people counted him out 2-3 years ago, including us. And he has been an elite box linebacker the last 2 seasons. Graded out the number 1 run defender and the number 1 tackler at linebacker the last 2 seasons among qualifying guys. Added 10 sacks as well. Wagner is going to allow Frankie Louvu to be the queen on the Commanders' chessboard, right? Quinn and Witt are going to move Louvu all over the field. Still have Jamin Davis, the 19th pick from 2021 at linebacker, as well as a nice depth piece. He's actually improved each of his first 3 seasons in the league. Defensive line, I think, has a shot to exceed expectation. There's veteran guys and there's familiar faces. You mentioned the two in the middle, Daron Payne and Jonathan Allen. Those are the horses inside. And, I hate to say this because they make so much money, but I fully expect that duo to play to peak now that there's a reason to play, right? Now that it's enjoyable to come into work every day. And if Jonathan Allen returns to his 2021 form, look out. That was a menace. 14% pressure rate on pass rush snaps from the inside, 2% missed tackle rate. Allen was just a demon in 2021. Daron Payne, if you've heard him, he's openly talked about playing with a renewed purpose. And then 36th pick, you got Johnny Newton, who is going to be the third man in the tackle rotation. Hopefully he can get up to speed. He did return to camp, but he had surgery on each of his feet. One in January, one in May, but he returned to camp this week. So that's a good sign. Maybe he's got about a month, 5 weeks or so to get up to speed. And then the familiar faces portion is Dorrance Armstrong and Dante Fowler follow Dan Quinn over from Dallas. So there isn't a transition phase for those two since they already know Quinn's scheme. They know his verbiage. Clelin Ferrell has raised his play to at least replacement level. And there's some word coming out that the youngsters, KJ Henry and Jean Baptiste, are flashing. And so, I know the names were bigger last season with Chase Young and Montez Sweat, who you mentioned, were offloaded there around the deadline. But Washington only finished 21st in pass rush win rate despite facing a bottom 10 schedule of pass protecting offensive lines last year. So it wasn't, the names weren't as great as the production. The secondary was horrific last season. From an efficiency standpoint, the Commanders' pass defense was the worst in the league by a long mile. Since we started tracking efficiency in 2007, it's one of the worst 10 secondaries. Clear improvement this season, right? Dan Quinn and Joe Witt have done a great job developing corners. It's also very clear the players have bought in. and he's fighting for a starting job, but 2023 first-round corner Emmanuel Forbes has put on 17 pounds this offseason. He's a better scheme fit in Quinn's system. The report from camp is the secondary is communicating better. They've gelled much quicker than anyone expected. I think the starting corner jobs are very fluid, but you have St. Juste, David, Castro Fields, and then obviously Forbes battling for the 2 spots. You mentioned Mike Sandstrill having a great camp. He seems locked into the slot job. Forrest and Chin at safety are replacement level. Butler and Quinn are battling to sneak into the starting safety roles. So there's lots of competition. I think the real positive, though, we're projecting the Commanders to face a bottom 7 schedule of passing off seasons. Last season, it was well above average. I don't think this is going to be an elite defense, but I do think the Commanders can go from league worst to slightly below average. I think that's real plausible this season.
When you look at the Commanders' big picture, have you seen them as a team professional bettors or buying or selling this offseason, or more of a holding pattern, knowing that there could be improvement from both an offensive and defensive side as the season progresses?
Well, as our listeners know, we were massive sellers on this club last year. Went under 6.5. Another group came in behind us and joined that party. I have not seen the sell in the market in terms of win total on Washington this year. I think you want to see what the enhanced coaching staff looks like, what the day-to-day looks like, right? When all the players were given those anonymous questions about grading organizations, Washington's came back like F minus in basically every single category, right? I mean, it was a dumpster fire. So just that renewed focus of like being okay coming into work, right? The quotes that you're hearing from Todd and Payne just suggest that this is now a professional outfit. It's going to take some time. Now, there is variance, right? If Jaden Daniels plays like the Heisman winner at the NFL level, Washington's going to blow through their win total. But I kind of want to see what that looks like first. But I think long-term, what I mentioned earlier is like you're buying this team no longer being the league laughingstock.
Hey, look, only one direction to go, and that's up for the Commanders as they continue their quest to win a playoff game for the first time in eternity. Hope springs eternal in a quest for a new stadium and an organization that will finally have some reason to be somewhat optimistic, at least going forward. You can follow Payne on social media at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, as always, for all things Bet the Board, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And Payne, it's that time in the show for the first NFL Best Bet of the preseason preview series. Hopefully, folks listened to our off-season edition and grabbed a very advantageous number going under a win total with a team in the AFC East. If you didn't happen to catch that best bet, we're not going to recap it for you here. Go back and listen to that show. Well, that number has been cleared out of the market and long since removed. But what have we found?
Boy, those camp reports, not very good.
No, not good at all.
Love to see that.
Not shocking in the least. The team that could be aspiring for one of the worst records in the league. Although, candidly, I know we'll get to the NFC West towards the end. Camp reports out here in my backyard, not exactly great. Who would have seen that coming with the appointment of Antonio Pierce, the head coach, but a different discussion for a different day. Best bet in terms of the NFC East or a different direction?
Listen, everyone already knows probably where we're going. We talked about these two teams at the top, so I'm going to be short here. Both Philadelphia and the Cowboys are time-stamped above. We spent 33 minutes on those two teams breaking down each side of the ball. You know, for full disclosure, we have Cowboys under 10.5 wins. We have the Eagles plus 115 in pocket. That was probably the most widely available number when there was more liquidity in the market. Those two numbers have been decimated. However, to win the division has not moved nearly as much. You mentioned how there's some different pricing throughout the market. Minus 125 is the peak. But if you look at the widely available number, it's still minus 110. So let's go with the Eagles to win the NFC East minus $1.10. Basically, your flat pricing for, weekly sides and totals. I think that still yields a great deal of value as opposed to trying to go under 9.5 now on the Cowboys. That's a number that I don't really have interest in going under right now, but still believe there's some really nice value there on the Eagles to win the division. I'd make it about another 25 to 30 cents higher than current widely available market pricing.
Hey, one other thing, too, that I want to get across to our listeners, for those folks who only really bet the NFL, may not have tuned in for all of the college football previews we did for the Power 4 leagues, with the Holy Trinity, myself, Brad Powers, and Payne, but all the heavy lifting that Brad did for some of the smaller conferences, just because we give out these futures, and it's something that'll keep people invested, not for 1 week, 2 weeks, but we hope the duration of the regular season. Don't go above and beyond with your bet sizing. Like Payne said, be responsible. Realize that the cost of capital, for those folks that have bankroll constraints, the last thing you want to do is tie up a disproportional amount of your bankroll on season-long bets if it doesn't allow you to fire week in, week out. So err on the side of caution there. We know they're fun. People love to get tied up in futures and win totals, but I do recommend that folks allocate accordingly for some of the season-long stuff, maybe a little bit differently than they will from the building of a week-to-week card, both in college and the NFL.
When you get to a certain level, you typically have two bankrolls, one for futures, one for your weekly betting. So,
yep, exactly. And look, for all those listeners that are out there that are aspiring to do this with a little bit more higher level of professionalism, we hope that's the case. But for those folks who may be betting NFL seriously for just the first time, just wanted to get that PSA out there for all of those guys and girls. All right, my friend, one division down, 7 to go. As far as cadence is concerned for these divisional previews, right back on the NFL grind, Mondays and Thursdays in terms of covering all of these various divisions. So the best part about these, if you can't listen in their entirety, every team will be time-stamped. It'll be there for your listening pleasure. We do the heavy lifting around here to keep some of that off your plate as you prep for the NFL season. That'll be here in just over a month, kicking off with the Hall of Fame game tonight between the Houston Texans and the Chicago Bears. For Payne Insider, I'm Todd Fuhrman. Best of luck with all of your preseason investments, and most importantly, with the Philadelphia Eagles to win the NFC East division ticket in hand. We'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.